The Townstead Visitor Centre occupied a modernist structure built in 1992 on a forested ridge overlooking the valley that gave the small Colorado town its name. The building was efficient and functional, designed by an architect who'd prioritized utility over aesthetics, who'd understood that visitor centers were primarily about information delivery and crowd management rather than aesthetic experience. The main floor contained displays about local geology, wildlife migration patterns, hiking trail conditions, and the region's natural history. There was a gift shop that sold overpriced books, maps, and souvenirs, the kind of merchandise that tourists purchased to commemorate their visit to places they'd often forget within a year. Administrative offices occupied the East Wing, containing desks, filing cabinets, and the infrastructure of park management. A small break room with a refrigerator and microwave served as the staff's designated space during shifts. The building had been designed with a basement, a decision that had seemed practical at the time of construction, providing storage for extra materials, archives of historical documents, emergency supplies, and the mechanical systems that maintained the structure's climate control during Colorado's extreme seasonal variations. The basement was accessed through a heavy metal door in the administrative office, a door that opened onto a concrete staircase descending into darkness and the particular smell of underground spaces, a combination of earth, machinery, and the mustiness of materials stored in conditions that never quite stabilized regardless of the climate control efforts. The basement itself was approximately 3,000 square feet, divided into several sections. One section contained metal shelving units loaded with extra display materials that rotated seasonally, winter wildlife information for the cold months, wildflower identification guides for summer visitors, fall foliage tracking materials for the brief spectacular season when the aspens turned gold. Another section housed archival materials, boxes of documents dating back to the visitor center's opening, historical photographs, old brochures and pamphlets documenting how the facility and the park's messaging had evolved over 3 decades. A storage area contained emergency supplies, spare office furniture, broken equipment waiting for repair or disposal, and the accumulated miscellaneous items that institutions accumulated over time. The mechanical systems occupied their own designated area. The HVAC equipment, water heater, electrical panels, and the various pipes and conduits that kept the building functioning. These systems were professionally maintained on a quarterly basis, with technicians from a Denver-based company arriving every 3 months to inspect, service, and perform preventive maintenance. The quarterly inspections had always revealed nothing unusual, nothing requiring repair or special attention. The basement's mechanical systems were aging but functional, reliable despite their decades of operation. My name is James R. Bess, and I was 30 years old when I took the position as day manager at the Townstead Visitor Center. I'd spent the previous 5 years working various positions in tourism and park management, moving between visitor centers, educational facilities, and outdoor recreation businesses across the western United States. I'd worked at visitor centers in Arizona, Utah, New Mexico, and Wyoming before arriving in Colorado, and each position had been similar to the others. Pleasant enough work, moderate pay, the kind of stability that had become increasingly important to me as I approached my 30s and understood that my career trajectory was unlikely to involve significant advancement or dramatic change. The Townstead position offered consistent hours, 7 a.m. to 5 p.m., 5 days a week, moderate pay, that allowed me to maintain an apartment in town and begin rebuilding some kind of financial security after years of living paycheck to paycheck. The job was straightforward. I arrived at 7 a.m., unlocked the building, activated the security system, reviewed any notes from the previous day's manager, and checked the visitor center's answering machine for any messages that had come in overnight. Throughout the day, I processed visitor inquiries, sold merchandise, maintained the displays to ensure they accurately reflected current conditions and seasonal information, and managed the administrative side of the center's operations. By 5 p.m., I locked up the building, ensured that the security system was activated, and drove home to my apartment, which was located in a modest neighborhood, about 15 minutes from the visitor center. I'd been working at the Townstead Visitor Center for approximately 3 months when the knocking began. 3 months of pleasant, unremarkable work. 3 months of helping people plan their hiking trips, selling overpriced guidebooks, answering questions about trail conditions, weather patterns, and local wildlife. 3 months of establishing a routine, becoming familiar with the building's layout, learning the names of regular visitors, and the particular challenges of managing the visitor center during the transition from fall to winter. The basement of the Townstead Visitor Center was a space I'd visited only occasionally during those first 3 months. Once to locate extra brochures about trail conditions during a busy summer weekend when we'd run out of the standard printed materials. Once to reset a circuit breaker when an electrical issue had temporarily shut down some of the main floor's lighting. Once to check on the water heater when the building's temperature had dropped unexpectedly during a late spring cold snap. Each time I'd descended into the basement, I'd found it unremarkable. Concrete walls painted an institutional beige, exposed pipes running along the ceiling, fluorescent lights mounted on metal frames, some of them flickering with the particular irritating rhythm of aging fixtures beginning to fail. The space smelled like old paper, like the specific mustiness that accumulated in poorly ventilated areas, and like machinery, the particular combination of oil, metal, and electricity that mechanical systems emitted. The basement was the kind of space that existed for function rather than comfort, the kind of space that most people would find unpleasant and would avoid spending unnecessary time in. On a Tuesday afternoon in October, during what had been an entirely ordinary shift characterized by moderate visitor traffic and routine administrative work, I'd heard the knocking. It came from below, a rhythmic tapping sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere within or beneath the basement. The sound was distinctive, clear enough to be audible, but not loud, distinct enough to be intentional, but subtle enough that it could potentially be dismissed as the building's mechanical systems producing unexpected noise. The pattern was regular. 3 taps, a pause that lasted approximately 2 seconds, 3 more taps. Then the pattern would repeat. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Over and over, with mechanical precision, with a consistency that suggested either a machine producing a regular sound or someone, deliberately creating a pattern designed to be noticed and acknowledged. I'd been standing at the gift shop counter, organizing merchandise, restocking books about Colorado geology, rearranging postcards featuring scenic vistas, checking inventory counts to determine what needed to be reordered. I'd paused in the middle of this task, my hands freezing in mid-motion, my attention completely captured by the sound. The knocking had seemed to come from directly beneath the floor where I was standing, from deep within the basement, from somewhere in the earth below the building's foundation. The first thing I'd done was check for rational explanations. Pipes sometimes made noises when water moved through them at particular pressures. Water heaters sometimes produced rhythmic sounds as heating elements cycled on and off. The building's electrical systems could produce unexpected auditory artifacts. Machinery could be unpredictable in the sounds it generated. HVAC systems could produce knocking noises when ductwork expanded or contracted in response to temperature changes. There were numerous legitimate mechanical explanations for the sound I was hearing, but the knocking had continued with such consistency, such deliberateness, that these explanations had seemed increasingly insufficient. The pattern was too regular, too intentional, too much like a code or a signal to be the result of random mechanical function. The pattern suggested purpose. The pattern suggested deliberate communication. I'd mentioned the sound to Sarah, the other visitor center manager who worked the shifts I didn't work, when she'd arrived to relieve me at 5 p.m. She'd listened to my description, nodded politely, and had suggested that it was probably something mechanical, something that the building systems sometimes did. She'd worked at the visitor center longer than I had, nearly 2 years, and she'd assured me that the building produced occasional unexplained noises, that this was not unusual, that I would probably stop noticing the sound after a while. But that night, at my apartment, I'd found myself thinking about the knocking. I'd replayed the pattern in my mind. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, and I'd found myself wondering what could produce such a regular, deliberate sound. I'd considered the basement's layout, the location of the mechanical systems, the placement of the pipes and electrical conduits. I'd thought about what might exist beneath the building's foundation, what could be generating a sound that seemed to come from so deep below the visible structure. The knocking had returned the next day. Same time, same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. I'd heard it while I was helping a visitor find information about eagle watching locations. I'd heard it while I was processing a sale at the gift shop counter. I'd heard it while I was in the administrative office, updating the computer's database of hiking trail conditions. I'd descended into the basement during my lunch break, following the sound, trying to locate its source and determine what was producing the knocking. The concrete staircase had descended into the basement proper, where the fluorescent lights cast their particular sickly illumination, creating sharp shadows and making the space feel simultaneously overly bright and somehow dark, a quality that fluorescent lighting seemed to produce in underground spaces, an inability to illuminate the space in a way that felt natural or comfortable. The knocking had seemed to come from the northeastern section of the basement, from beneath the concrete floor where some of the oldest archived materials were stored. I'd walked to that location, listening carefully, trying to pinpoint the exact source of the sound. The pattern had been clearly audible. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, but I'd been unable to determine the precise location from which it was emanating. I'd looked around the basement, examining what was visible, the storage shelves containing boxes of old materials, the mechanical systems humming quietly as they maintained the building's infrastructure, the pipes that ran through the space in what seemed like no particular organized pattern, the electrical panels, the concrete walls, the floor that seemed completely solid despite the sounds apparently coming from beneath it. But I'd found no obvious source for the knocking, no machinery that seemed to be producing the sound, no pipes that appeared to be the culprit, no visible indication of what could be creating such a deliberate, patterned noise. The sound seemed to originate from the earth itself, from whatever lay beneath the concrete foundation of the building. I'd returned to the main floor and had attempted to continue my work, to resume my routine tasks as though nothing unusual had occurred. But the knocking had persisted, audible throughout the building whenever I was paying attention to it, present in the background of every task I performed. The sound had been impossible to ignore once I'd become aware of it. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, over and over, relentless in its consistency, maddening in its regularity. By the time I'd locked up the visitor center at 5 p.m., the knocking had finally stopped. The silence that had replaced it had been almost as disturbing as the knocking itself had been. The absence of a sound that I'd become accustomed to, the void where the pattern had been. I'd mentioned the knocking to the district park manager when he'd visited the visitor center the next day. He'd listened politely, nodded, and had suggested that it was probably the building's mechanical system producing unexpected noise, a common occurrence in older structures, he'd explained. He'd said that visitor centers sometimes produced strange sounds as building materials responded to temperature changes and settling. He'd assured me that there was likely nothing to be concerned about, that these kinds of noises were normal, that I would probably stop noticing them after a while. His explanation had sounded reasonable. It had sounded like the kind of rational, logical assessment that someone with experience managing buildings would provide. But I'd heard doubt in his voice, uncertainty beneath the reassuring words. He'd seemed to be trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince me. But the knocking had returned the next day, and the day after that, always at approximately the same time in the afternoon, typically between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m., during the period when visitor traffic tended to slow down, and I found myself working in the main floor's administrative area, processing paperwork and preparing for the closing procedures. Always the same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. Repeating endlessly, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Always seemingly coming from beneath the basement floor. Always audible throughout the building. Always impossible to ignore once you became aware of it. The sound had begun to affect my work. I'd found myself becoming distracted, unable to concentrate on tasks, constantly listening for the pattern, anticipating its arrival, feeling relief when it finally stopped. My interactions with visitors had become less engaged, more automatic. I'd been present in the building, but my attention had been pulled downward, toward the basement, toward whatever was producing the sound. Sarah had noticed my distraction. During one afternoon when she'd stopped by to drop off some materials before her evening shift, she'd asked if everything was okay. I'd mentioned the knocking, explained that it continued every afternoon, described how I'd been unable to locate its source. "Oh," she'd said, in a tone that suggested she'd suddenly remembered something important. "Yeah, the knocking. I heard it once, a few months ago. I went down to the basement and never found anything. I assumed it was something mechanical. It stopped after a couple of days, so I forgot about it." "It's been happening every day for a week," I'd said. Sarah's expression had shifted slightly. Something in her face had suggested that she was revising her understanding of the situation, that she was recognizing that my experience might be different from her brief encounter with the sound. "That's unusual," she'd finally said. "Maybe you should contact maintenance, have them do a more thorough inspection." I'd brought in a maintenance technician on a Friday afternoon, explaining the situation and requesting that he investigate what might be producing the sound. He'd arrived with various tools and instruments, a stethoscope for listening to pipes, a thermal imaging camera for detecting temperature anomalies, testing equipment for the electrical systems, a basic metal detector. He'd descended into the basement and had spent approximately 2 hours examining the mechanical systems, inspecting the pipes, checking electrical connections, testing the water heater, and attempting to locate the source of the knocking. I'd remained in the administrative office while he'd worked, unable to fully focus on my tasks, waiting to hear what he'd discovered. He'd emerged from the basement approximately 2 hours later, shaking his head, his expression indicating that he'd been unable to locate the source of the sound. He'd heard the knocking himself. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. But he'd been unable to determine what was producing it or where it was coming from. Everything in the basement appears to be functioning normally, he'd reported. All the mechanical systems are operating as they should be. The pipes are intact, no leaks. The electrical systems are functional. I don't see any evidence of what could be producing that sound. Could it be coming from outside the building? I'd asked. Could it be external? Could be something external, he'd suggested, offering the kind of explanation that sounded plausible, but ultimately wasn't satisfying. Could be the wind hitting the building's exterior in a particular way, creating a vibration that gets transmitted through the foundation. Could be something in the ground beneath the building. Rocks settling, soil shifting, groundwater movement, seismic activity. Colorado has a history of minor seismic events. You can get sounds that seem to come from one place but actually originate from somewhere completely different. The structure interacts with the surrounding environment in complex ways. He'd recommended that I not worry about it, that these kinds of unexplained building noises were not uncommon, that they would likely resolve themselves eventually. He'd charged me for his service, a substantial amount that the visitor center would have to document in its maintenance budget, and he'd left. But the knocking had continued. The pattern persisted every afternoon, as regular as clockwork, as deliberate as intentional communication could be. Over the following weeks, I'd found myself becoming increasingly aware of the knocking, increasingly focused on locating its source, increasingly convinced that there was something intentional about the pattern, something that suggested deliberate communication rather than random mechanical function. I'd researched the history of the property, looking for any information about what had existed before the visitor center was built. The land had been undeveloped when purchased by the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department in 1990. Before that, it had been privately owned, ranching land, from what I could determine. There was no documented history of structures, no indication of underground facilities, no explanation for what might be producing the sound from beneath the building. I'd also researched the building's construction, examining the architectural plans and the engineering documents. The basement had been built according to standard specifications. The concrete foundation was standard depth. The building's structural integrity had been verified during the design process and certified upon completion. There was nothing in the documentation that suggested anything unusual about the basement or the space beneath it. One afternoon in late October, while the visitor center was empty of guests, a slow Tuesday when the fall hiking season was waning but winter hadn't yet arrived, I'd made a deliberate decision. I'd closed the visitor center early, locked the front doors, and I'd descended into the basement with the intention of sitting in the space and waiting for the knocking to occur, hoping that by being present, by being completely focused on the phenomenon, I might be able to understand what was happening. I'd found a folding chair stored near the archived materials, and I'd positioned it in the northeastern section of the basement, directly above what seemed to be the source of the knocking. I'd sat in the basement, surrounded by boxes of old documents and forgotten materials, waiting in the fluorescent light for the sound to begin. The waiting had been longer than I'd anticipated. I'd been sitting in the basement for nearly 30 minutes before the knocking began. But at approximately 3:30 p.m., the sound had started. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The sound had been clearly audible, close enough to suggest that whatever was producing it was not far away, deliberate enough to suggest intentional communication. I'd sat in the basement, listening to the pattern repeat, and I'd found myself becoming mesmerized by the regularity of it, by the consistency, by the implication that something, someone, was trying to communicate with me in the only way available to them. The knocking had continued for approximately 10 minutes, then stopped. The silence that followed had been complete, absolute. I'd waited, hoping that the knocking would resume, hoping that a second cycle would begin. But the silence had persisted. Whatever had been knocking had stopped when I'd descended into the basement, when I'd positioned myself directly above its source, when I'd demonstrated my awareness and my intention to understand what was happening. The implication of that observation had been significant. If whatever was producing the knocking had stopped when I'd descended into the basement, if it had ceased its communication when I'd shown that I was paying attention, then there was a direct connection between my actions and the phenomenon. Whatever was producing the knocking was aware of my presence. It was responding to my behavior. It was reacting to my attempts at understanding. I'd placed my hand on the concrete floor, directly above what seemed to be the source of the sound, trying to feel vibrations, trying to sense if there was something beneath the surface that could produce the sound, trying to establish a more direct connection with whatever was producing the knocking. The silence had continued. No knocking resumed. No response to my gesture. I'd removed my hand, and after a moment of continued silence, the knocking had resumed. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The pattern had returned, unchanged, continuing as though my action had been acknowledged, but had not altered the fundamental nature of what was being communicated. I'd realized then that whatever was producing the knocking was aware of me. It was responding to my presence. It was reacting to my attempts at contact. It was communicating in the only way it could communicate, through sound, through a simple pattern that transcended language, through a rhythm that could be perceived and understood by human consciousness. The implications had been profound. If whatever was beneath the visitor center was aware of me, if it was responding to my actions, if it was attempting to establish communication, then there was something sentient beneath the building's foundation. There was something that existed in whatever space lay below the concrete floor, something that had been knocking for weeks, trying to make contact, trying to establish communication through the only mechanism available to it. The pattern continued for another 5 minutes, then stopped. The silence returned. I'd remained in the basement for another hour, sitting in the folding chair, hoping that the knocking would resume, hoping that some other form of communication would emerge. But nothing had happened. The basement had remained silent. The mechanical systems had continued to hum, and whatever had been knocking had apparently finished its communication for that day. I'd climbed the stairs back to the main floor, and I'd locked the visitor center, driving home with a mind full of questions and a growing sense that I was dealing with something that extended beyond normal explanation. That night, I'd knocked back. I'd returned to my apartment, gone to my bathroom, and I'd practiced the pattern 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. I'd repeated the pattern until I could execute it with the same precision and consistency that the original knocking displayed. I'd wanted to be able to mirror the communication exactly, to demonstrate my understanding of what was being attempted, to establish a reciprocal form of communication. The next afternoon, as soon as the knocking began, I'd descended into the basement. I'd positioned my hand over the concrete floor, directly above the source of the sound, and I'd knocked back. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. I'd repeated the pattern several times, matching the rhythm as precisely as possible, attempting to mirror the communication in a gesture of reciprocal engagement. The knocking had stopped immediately upon my response. There had been silence for what had felt like an extended moment, though it had probably been only 30 seconds or a minute. The absence of sound had been somehow more unsettling than the presence of the knocking had been. The silence had suggested that something was happening, some kind of activity or process occurring beneath the floor, something that I was unable to perceive, something that was responding to my communication. And then the knocking had resumed. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. The same pattern, unchanged, continuing as though my response hadn't been acknowledged, hadn't been processed, hadn't altered the fundamental nature of what was being communicated. But something had changed. The knocking had seemed slightly louder, slightly more intense, slightly more urgent. The pattern had persisted for longer than before, nearly 20 minutes, before finally stopping. The knocking had continued for another 2 weeks after that initial exchange. I'd descended into the basement every afternoon. I'd matched the pattern with my own knocking. I'd attempted to establish some form of two-way communication, but the knocking had never evolved beyond the original pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, over and over, never varying, never becoming more complex, never responding in any way that suggested my communication was being understood or acknowledged. The knocking would begin at approximately 3 p.m., continue for varying lengths of time, sometimes 10 minutes, sometimes an hour, and then stop. During the knocking sessions, I would descend into the basement and I would knock back. Each time, the knocking would stop when I first knocked in response. There would be a moment of silence, and then it would resume, slightly louder, slightly more intense, as though whatever was below the floor was becoming stronger, more present, more capable of transmitting its signal through the concrete and earth that separated us. I'd begun to feel a compulsion to descend into the basement, to position myself above the source of the knocking, to match the pattern with my own strikes against the concrete floor. The compulsion had grown stronger as the weeks progressed. I'd found myself thinking about the knocking constantly, anticipating its arrival, feeling incomplete when the day's session concluded. My work at the visitor center had begun to suffer. My attention had been increasingly diverted. I'd been less helpful with visitors, less engaged with my administrative tasks, less present in the physical world and more focused on the phenomenon occurring beneath the building. Sarah had noticed the change in my behavior. She'd asked me directly whether everything was okay, whether there was something wrong, whether I needed help with anything. I'd assured her that everything was fine, that I was simply tired, that the seasonal transition was affecting my sleep schedule. But she'd seemed unconvinced, and I could see concern in her expression. The district park manager had also begun to notice something was different. During one of his visits to the visitor center, he'd mentioned that he'd received a report that visitor satisfaction scores had declined slightly in recent weeks, that a few visitors had commented that the day manager seemed distracted or unhelpful. He'd suggested that I might need to focus more on my responsibilities to the visitors, on providing the quality of service that the visitor center was designed to provide. I'd acknowledged his feedback and had promised to improve my engagement with visitors, but I'd known, even as I'd made that promise, that I was unlikely to keep it. The knocking had become the center of my existence, the primary focus of my consciousness, the most important aspect of my life at that moment. By early November, the knocking had increased in intensity and frequency. It was occurring multiple times per day, not just during the afternoon hours. I would hear it while processing visitors. I would hear it while managing the gift shop. I would hear it while in the administrative office. The pattern remained consistent. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. But it was becoming more frequent, more demanding, more insistent. And then on a Wednesday afternoon, something changed. I'd descended into the basement at the first indication of knocking. I'd positioned myself over what had become familiar territory, directly above the source of the sound. I'd prepared to knock back, matching the pattern as I'd learned to do. But before I could strike the concrete floor, the knocking had changed. The pattern had shifted. Instead of 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, the sound had become rapid, continuous. The 3-tap pattern had broken down into a cascade of knocking sounds, as though something below the floor was striking repeatedly, rapidly, with increasing urgency. The sound had been louder than it had ever been. The vibrations had been strong enough that I could feel them through the concrete floor, could sense the impact of whatever was below the surface striking against the floor with considerable force. The speed had been escalating, the knocking starting slower and gradually increasing in tempo, becoming faster and faster, more and more rapid. I'd backed away from the area, my instinct warning me that something was changing, that whatever had been producing the sound was becoming more intense, more powerful, more present. The knocking had continued, faster and faster, louder and louder, the vibrations becoming more pronounced. And then, with a sound like a crack of thunder, a portion of the concrete floor had fractured. I'd stood in the basement, staring at the crack that had appeared in the concrete. The crack had originated from the area directly below where I'd been standing, had spread outward in multiple directions, had created a visible fissure in what had always appeared to be a solid, unbroken surface. I'd stood completely still, not moving, barely breathing, my mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. The concrete had cracked from beneath. Something below the floor had struck with enough force to crack solid concrete. The knocking hadn't been a sound emanating from distant machinery or geological activity. It had been something deliberately striking against the floor, something with sufficient power and determination to actually damage the building's structure. The knocking had stopped. The sudden cessation of sound had been almost as shocking as the cracking of the concrete had been. The silence had been absolute, complete, profound. I'd remained in the basement for several minutes, staring at the crack, trying to understand what had happened, trying to process the reality of what I'd witnessed. Then I'd climbed the stairs, and I'd immediately contacted the park manager, reporting that there appeared to be structural damage in the basement that required immediate attention. The maintenance technician had returned within 2 hours. I'd led him to the basement, and I'd shown him the crack in the concrete floor. His expression had shifted from professional concern to something closer to alarm when he'd examined the damage. "This is serious," he'd said. "This suggests structural movement, possible foundation settling, potentially something more problematic. This needs professional engineering evaluation." An engineer had arrived the next day. He'd spent several hours examining the basement, taking measurements, documenting the crack, checking the rest of the structure for any signs of additional damage or instability. His conclusion had been that the crack appeared to have been caused by external pressure from beneath the concrete, as though something had struck or pushed against the floor with considerable force. He'd recommended that a deeper investigation be conducted, that the concrete be inspected from below if possible, that the soil beneath the building be examined to determine what might have caused such concentrated force. But when the engineer had attempted to investigate further, to schedule a more thorough examination, the Park District had decided that the cost of such investigation would be prohibitive. Instead, they'd decided to repair the crack, to reinforce the concrete, and to monitor the area for any signs of additional damage. The crack had been repaired, new concrete had been poured, the surface had been leveled and smoothed. The evidence of what had happened had been sealed away beneath new material. And the knocking had stopped completely. I'd waited, listening for the sound to resume, hoping that it would return, finding myself almost disappointed when silence persisted. The knocking that had defined my existence for the past several weeks had ceased entirely. The communication attempt that had grown increasingly intense and demanding had ended. I'd returned to the basement multiple times, positioning myself above where the crack had been, hoping that the knocking would resume. But no sound had come. Whatever had been beneath the floor, whatever had been trying to communicate with me through that persistent pattern of knocks, had apparently given up or had achieved whatever goal it had been pursuing. By late November, the crack had been fully repaired and sealed. The basement had returned to its previous appearance, with no visible indication that anything unusual had occurred. The building's mechanical systems continued to function normally. The structure remained stable, with no signs of additional damage or settling. I continued to work at the Townstead Visitor Center. The job remained pleasant. The hours remained predictable. The work remained unremarkable in most respects. I helped visitors plan their outdoor experiences. I provided accurate information about trails, camping spots, water availability, and seasonal wildlife. I maintained the facility to ensure it remained welcoming and functional. I processed paperwork, managed inventory, and performed the various administrative tasks that constituted the work of a visitor center manager. But something had fundamentally changed within me. Sometimes, during quiet afternoons when the visitor center is empty of guests, when the light outside is beginning to shift toward evening, I find myself descending into the basement. I stand in the area where the crack had been, where the knocking had originated, where whatever had been trying to communicate had ultimately stopped. I listen to the ambient sounds of the building, the hum of the mechanical systems, the settling of the structure as temperature and humidity shift, the particular acoustic properties of a building designed for function rather than comfort. And I wait. I wait for the knocking to resume. I wait for the pattern to return. 3 taps, pause, 3 taps. I wait for communication to be re-established, for contact to be renewed, for whatever existed beneath the concrete floor to make itself known again. But the silence persists. The knocking never returns. Whatever was beneath the Townstead Visitor Center, whether it was a creature, a consciousness, a manifestation of the landscape itself, or something that defied easy categorization, has remained silent since that day in November when the concrete had cracked under the force of its final attempt to establish communication. I wonder what was trying to communicate with me. I wonder what existed beneath the building's foundation, what consciousness or awareness was attempting to establish contact with the human world above. I wonder whether my response to its knocking, my mimicking of the pattern, my descent into the basement, my attempt to establish reciprocal communication, meant something significant, or whether it had been merely a trigger that had intensified whatever process was occurring beneath the floor. I wonder whether the crack in the concrete had been an attempt to break through, to breach the barrier between its world and mine, to establish more direct contact. I wonder whether the sudden cessation of knocking had indicated success, that whatever had been beneath the floor had finally achieved whatever goal it had been pursuing, or failure, that the attempt at communication had been abandoned as futile. I never received an answer to these questions. The visitor center remained silent on that front. The knocking pattern never resumed, and whatever was beneath the concrete foundation has remained inaccessible to me, separated by layers of new concrete and earth, existing in a space that I cannot enter, communicating only through the memory of 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, the signal from beneath, the attempt at connection, the voice of whatever exists beyond the visible world, waiting in the darkness, hoping to be understood. The Townstead Visitor Center continues to function, continues to serve its purpose of providing information and guidance to visitors exploring Colorado's natural landscape. The building settles and shifts with seasonal temperature changes. The mechanical systems hum and cycle with their particular rhythms. The fluorescent lights flicker and hum in their characteristic way. And beneath the concrete floor, in whatever space exists below the building's foundation, there is silence. A silence that was perhaps earned through communication, through the exchange of a simple pattern, through an attempt at connection between 2 existences separated by layers of concrete and earth. I maintain my position at the visitor center. I perform my duties. I help people understand the landscape around them. And I continue to listen during quiet afternoons for the sound that may never come again. The signal from beneath, the attempt at communication, the voice of whatever exists beneath the building, waiting in the darkness, hoping to be understood.